My daughter called me fragile for the first time on a Tuesday in September, over coffee she hadn't brought, in a kitchen she didn't own, using words she hadn't chosen herself. She didn't say fragile directly. Claire had always been too careful for direct. What she said, while standing at my counter with both hands wrapped around one of my mugs, was, "Mom, Marcus and I have been talking. We think it might be time to have a real conversation about your situation." Your situation. I was 64 years old. I was standing at my kitchen counter slicing tomatoes I had grown myself, in a garden I had planted myself, in a house I had owned for 31 years. My hands were steady. My eyes were sharp. 3 weeks earlier, my doctor had looked at my blood work and said, and I am quoting him directly, "Flora, whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I turned around and looked at my daughter. She was 40 years old. She had my mother's cheekbones and her father's stubbornness and, for the past 6 years, her husband's vocabulary. "I'm listening," I said. That was my first mistake, not the last, but the first. My name is Flora. I have lived in this house since 1993. Gerald and I bought it the year Claire turned 4 and her brother Patrick was born, the year I was finishing my master's degree while working part-time at the county assessor's office, because that is simply what women of my generation did. We held 3 things at once, and we did not drop any of them, and we did not discuss how heavy they were. The house is a craftsman. 4 bedrooms, deep front porch, a backyard big enough for a serious garden. Gerald and I signed the mortgage at this kitchen table on a Thursday in October, and I remember the exact quality of the afternoon light coming through the window because it landed on Gerald's hands as he signed, and I thought, this is the light of something permanent. This is the light of staying. We stayed for 26 years together. Gerald died in 2019, heart attack. Sudden and complete, the way he would have preferred it if anyone had thought to ask. He was 67. We had a list on the refrigerator, places before 70, and we had made it through 4 of the 11 when his heart simply decided it was done. I will not pretend the years after were easy. They were not. Grief is not a season. It does not end when the weather changes. It is more like a piece of furniture you rearrange around. Some mornings you still walk into the room expecting it to be somewhere it isn't. But by 2021, I had relearned how to live. I relearned how to cook for one without it feeling like a punishment. I relearned the geometry of sleeping in the middle of the bed. I repainted the living room a shade of deep green that Gerald had vetoed for 26 years, and I stood in that room the afternoon it was finished and understood that I had been right about that color for longer than some marriages last. I was not fragile. I was a woman who had taken herself apart after loss and put herself back together, quietly, without asking anyone to hand her the pieces. But Claire had married Marcus in 2018, and Marcus had opinions about everything and evidence for none of them. I want to tell you about Marcus because to understand what happened, you have to understand what Marcus was. Marcus was 41 years old and worked in something he called brand architecture, which, as far as I could determine across 6 years of Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings, meant that he attended meetings, produced slides, and spoke with great authority about things other people had built. He had never owned property. He had never grown anything. He had never, to my knowledge, repaired a single object in his own home. When something broke, Marcus replaced it, and when something couldn't be replaced, Marcus hired someone, and when he couldn't afford to hire someone, Marcus looked for a family member who could absorb the cost and called it a solution. He called me Flora instead of Mom. That was fine. What was not fine was the specific way he said it, with a small pause before my name and a slight forward lean, the way a doctor leans in before delivering a diagnosis. He had started doing this somewhere around 2022. By 2023, the lean had a tilt of concern to it. By the September of Claire's kitchen visit, the tilt had become a fully formed strategy. I recognized the strategy because Gerald had spent 31 years as a contract attorney, and over 31 years of weeknight dinners, he had described it to me with remarkable precision. He called it the patient approach. Someone identifies an asset that belongs to someone else. They don't take it directly. That's too obvious, too easy to resist. Instead, they construct a story. The story is always about need, about safety, about family. The asset holder is repositioned in the story, not as the owner, but as the problem, the fragile one, the burden, the situation. Once the asset holder believes the story, the asset changes hands almost voluntarily. Gerald used to say he'd seen it 100 times. He'd helped a dozen clients undo it. He had told me once, sitting in this exact kitchen in the fall of 2017, "Flora, if I ever go before you and any member of this family starts using the word situation to describe you, call Susan Barr the same day." Susan Barr was our attorney. I had thought in 2017 that this was the kind of thing Gerald said because he'd seen too much. The kind of worry that accumulates when you've spent decades watching families take each other apart over money. In September 2024, I understood that Gerald had simply been paying attention. The campaign began officially in November. I call it a campaign because that is what it was. It had phases. Phase 1. Claire began mentioning, in phone calls that became more frequent and more solicitous, that their apartment lease was ending in March. This was stated as information. It was actually an opening position. Phase 2. Marcus texted me an article, just something he'd come across, thought I might find interesting, about multi-generational living and the emotional benefits for older homeowners. I read it twice. The phrase older homeowners appeared 7 times. I counted. Phase 3. A second article 2 weeks later. This one was about fall risks for women living alone. I was 64 and had not fallen. I noted that neither article contained any questions. Both contained conclusions. Phase 4. Thanksgiving. Claire and Marcus arrived an hour before Patrick, which I later understood was intentional. We sat in the living room, my green living room, and Marcus set a folder on the coffee table, opened it with the confidence of a man who had practiced this moment, and said, "Flora, we've been giving this a lot of thought, and we think we've landed on something that could really work for everyone." The proposal, as Marcus presented it over the next 20 minutes, while Claire looked at her hands, was this. Claire and Marcus would move into the house. I would be transitioned, that was the word he used, transitioned, into the downstairs guest suite, which he described as perfect for your needs at this stage, another phrase I filed away. They would take over what he called the household responsibilities. In exchange, they would take over the mortgage. There was no mortgage. The house had been paid off since 2011. I did not say this. Major decisions about the property, any renovations, future improvements, or potential sale, would require what Marcus called a mutual decision-making framework. 3 votes, but Claire and Marcus were a unit. I was one. The math was not complicated. "It would be such a relief," Claire said, finally looking up, "to know that someone was here, that you weren't alone." "And frankly," Marcus said, leaning forward, "it just makes good financial sense. Real estate in this area is appreciating. It would be a shame to see that value sitting underleveraged." Underleveraged. He called my home underleveraged. The home where I had brought both of my children back from the hospital. The home where Gerald had died in the upstairs bedroom at 6:40 in the morning on a Wednesday in November, and where I had sat beside him for an hour before I called anyone because I was not ready to share that quiet with the world yet. I set my wine glass down very carefully. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the folder. "Let me think about it," I said. They smiled. They thought that meant yes. I spent 10 days thinking. Mostly I was preparing. I called Susan Barr on a Monday morning. I laid out the situation. I used that word deliberately, alone, to myself before she could hear it. And she listened the way she always has, completely, without interruption, until I was finished. "Has anyone asked you to sign anything?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "I believe that's coming." "Then before anything comes, let's meet. I want you to understand exactly what your deed says, what your rights are as sole owner, and what any family housing agreement would actually require to be enforceable." We met that Thursday. I took notes. I left feeling the way you feel after you have confirmed that the ground is still solid under your feet, and it was only someone else's voice that was suggesting otherwise. I called Patrick that evening. Patrick lived in Portland. He called every Sunday without needing to be reminded, sent birthday cards that arrived on time, and had the particular gift of listening without immediately converting what he heard into advice. He had never liked Marcus. He expressed this by simply never discussing him, which I had always respected as a form of self-discipline. I told him what was happening. There was a silence. "Mom," he said, "I know." "How long has this been building?" I said, "since Gerald died. I think I was always the plan. I just didn't know I was being planned." Another silence. Then, "What do you need?" "Right now, just be aware. I'll tell you when I need more." "I'm aware," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, level, quiet, certain, that sounded exactly like his father. I had to put my hand over my mouth for a moment so he wouldn't hear anything he shouldn't have to hear. December arrived cold and early. Claire called 3 times a week now. The calls were warmer than they had been in years, attentive, curious, full of small questions about how I was feeling and whether the house was cold and had I been getting out enough. She asked about my joints twice. I had never in my life had a problem with my joints. I answered every call with warmth and gave away nothing. Marcus sent a 3rd article. This one was about the psychological benefits of downsizing for women in their 60s. I saved it in a folder on my desktop labeled Research, which felt appropriate. The formal presentation arrived on December 14th, a Saturday. They drove out together. Claire brought a coffee cake from the bakery on Elm Street, the one with the cardamom glaze I have loved for 20 years. The cake told me the conversation had been rehearsed. Marcus had always led with a gift before a request. He had once brought flowers before asking to borrow Gerald's truck, returned it 3 days late and half a tank of gaslight, and acted as though the flowers had settled the matter entirely. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Gerald and I had signed the mortgage in 1993, the same table where Claire had done her homework in 2nd grade, where Patrick had cried when his dog died, where I had eaten alone every night for the first 3 months after Gerald was gone, not because I was fragile, but because I was learning what silence tasted like, and I needed to learn it without witnesses. Marcus set a folder on that table. I looked at it. I looked at him. I looked at my daughter. Claire was watching the coffee cake. "Dorothy," he began, and then caught himself. "Flora, we want you to know that everything here comes from a place of genuine love and concern." I noticed he had almost used the wrong name. I filed that too. The document inside the folder was 4 pages long. It had a title, Informal Family Residential Sharing Agreement. It had been typed in a clean sans serif font. Someone had put real time into it. I read all 4 pages while they waited. I did not rush. I turned each page with the same attention I would give a contract, which it was, regardless of the font. The agreement gave Claire and Marcus primary residential rights to the home. My name would remain on the deed for now, italicized for now, with language that implied this was a temporary courtesy rather than an immutable legal fact. I would occupy the downstairs suite. The upstairs, the back garden, the garage, and all common areas would be managed jointly, meaning by them. Any major decision regarding the property required mutual agreement, which meant their 2 votes against my 1. In a section near the bottom, beneath a heading called Future Planning, there was a paragraph about the benefits of transferring the deed fully once the arrangement had been established, for estate simplicity and tax purposes. Estate simplicity. For whose estate? My estate. The estate I would need to be dead to have. I set the last page down. "Marcus," I said, "how long did it take you to write this?" "We put it together over the last few weeks," he said, "just to give the conversation some structure." "It's thorough," I said. "You included italics, in a spoken conversation." A short silence. "Flora," he said, with the lean, with the tilt, "we just want to make sure you're taken care of." I looked at my daughter. "Claire," I said, "look at me, sweetheart." She looked up. Her eyes were careful and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Do you want to live here?" I asked. "Not the plan. Not Marcus. Not what makes sense. You, my daughter. Do you want to live in this house?" The kitchen was very quiet. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said, "I think it's the right thing to do." The right thing to do was not yes. I had raised this woman. I knew every inflection she had ever made. "I think it's the right thing to do" was the answer of someone who had agreed to want something she didn't actually want, and had been agreeing for long enough that she'd forgotten the difference. I stood up. I walked to the counter and put the kettle on. I let the silence sit in the kitchen for a full minute while the water heated, because silence, deployed correctly, is more powerful than any argument. Then I turned around. "I'm going to tell you what is going to happen," I said. My voice was even. I had practiced even. "Nothing in this folder is going to happen. Not this version, not a revised version, not a gentler version delivered with better coffee cake. This house belongs to me. My name is on the deed. There is no mortgage. There is no under-leveraged asset. There's a home that I have maintained and paid for and lived in and loved for 31 years, and I am not transitioning into the guest suite of my own house." Marcus started to speak. "I'm not finished." He stopped. "I am not fragile. I am not a situation. I am not a problem that needs your solution. I am a 64-year-old woman in good health who grows her own tomatoes and owns her home and has not once asked either of you for help managing my life." I picked up the folder from the table, walked to the recycling bin beside the refrigerator, set it inside. "If you would like to be part of my life, truly part of it, as family, honestly, without a folder, I want that. If your lease situation in March is a genuine hardship, I can recommend a realtor who works with first-time buyers, and I will happily pass along her number. But the plan in that folder is finished. It was finished before it started." The kitchen was perfectly still. Claire's eyes had filled, but she was not crying. She was holding something in, and I recognized what it was because I had held it in myself for 3 months after Gerald died, the feeling of something finally being said out loud that had been too loud inside for too long. "I have coffee cake," I said. "I would very much like to enjoy it. Would either of you like a slice?" They stayed 2 hours. The conversation that followed was quiet, careful, strange, but real in a way that our conversations had not been in years. Marcus was subdued. He ate his coffee cake and looked at the table. Claire and I talked, slowly at first, and then not slowly. She told me she had been stressed. I told her I knew. I did not say more than that. Some things can wait. They left in the late afternoon. At the door, Claire hugged me and held on one beat longer than usual. I let her. She was my daughter, and she was carrying things I had not put down for her, and she was going to have to set them down herself. I watched their car until it turned at the end of the street. Then I went inside, called Patrick, and told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The recycling bin, Mom." "It seemed accurate," I said. He laughed. It was Gerald's laugh. He had always laughed exactly like his father, from the same place, with the same sudden warmth. I had to close my eyes for a moment. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm at home." March came. Claire and Marcus signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in the city. No further proposals arrived. Marcus stopped sending articles. He also stopped calling me Flora. He didn't call me anything now, which I found to be the most straightforwardly honest thing he had communicated in 6 years. Claire called more or less as before. The calls were different now, lighter, more like the calls we used to have before the plan had taken up all the space between us. She told me about work. I told her about the garden. Once she laughed at something I said, and it was her real laugh, the one from before, and I thought, there she is, still there. Just had been somewhere else for a while. In April, I replanted the garden, tomatoes again, and this year I added zucchini. Gerald had always said zucchini was redundant and excessive, which was precisely why I had never planted it while he was alive. I put on his old canvas work gloves, still hanging on the peg in the garage where he left them, and worked in the dirt on a Tuesday afternoon with the radio on and no one asking me how my joints felt. The green living room looked right. It had always looked right. The kitchen table held its history without apology. The mortgage, the homework, the heartbreaks, the Thanksgiving, the folder which had been collected with the Tuesday recycling and taken away as though it had never had ambitions. In May, Patrick flew in. We sat on the back porch in the evening with good wine and the kind of conversation that has nowhere to be. I told him I had been looking at the places before 70 list. "How many are left?" he asked. 7, I said. "I'm going to do 3 of them this year, on my own. Carry on only, no fixed itinerary." He smiled. "Dad would have hated that." "I know," I said. "Part of why I'm going." He raised his glass. I raised mine. The garden was coming in beautifully behind us. The tomatoes were early. The zucchini was, exactly as Gerald had predicted, producing at a volume that bordered on aggressive. I was 64 years old. I was in my green living room, in my paid-off house, with my name on the deed exactly where it had been for 31 years. There is something that happens to women as they age that no one prepares them for with sufficient seriousness. The world begins to speak about them in a particular register, the register of situation, of concern, of what makes sense for someone at your stage. And the register is so consistent, so patient, so carefully disguised as love, that a woman can begin to mistake it for truth. It is not truth, it is discomfort. Other people's discomfort with a woman who has not become smaller, who has not begun to apologize for taking up space, who owns something valuable and has no intention of handing it over because someone typed a 4-page document in a clean font and brought the right coffee cake. The deed to my house has my name on it. My name alone. Gerald put it that way on purpose, and I understood why when the folder appeared on my kitchen table in December. The house is 31 years old. The garden grows every spring without asking anyone's permission. The living room has been green since 2021, and it will stay green until I decide otherwise. I have been many things in this house. A young wife, a mother, a student, a widow, a woman learning to live alone and discovering slowly, and then all at once, that alone did not mean lonely. That alone, chosen freely in a house you love, on your own terms, tastes like something close to peace. I stopped purchasing my place at my own table in December. It cost me a folder in the recycling bin and a Saturday afternoon. It was the easiest money I never spent. Gerald, who always believed I was right about the color of that living room, would have raised his glass. I raised mine back.